Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Rosalind Malloy. I head up the policy and practice team in the agency and I'm your chair for this morning's session. This is the second event in the 2021 Housing Agencies Conference programme and I'm delighted that you can join us and our panel of speakers today. Today's session focuses in on some of the elements contained within the first pathway in Housing for All. This pathway sets out how to support home ownership and increase affordability. The different streams for achieving this are set out in the plan with an overall delivery target of 54,000 affordable homes to be delivered between now and 2030. We'd like this session to be as interactive as possible, and so there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists. So we'd ask you to post your questions in the Q&A panel on your screens and to let us know who you would like your questions directed to. If you do experience any technical issues, just put tech into the chat box with your problem and we will follow up with you. This morning we have a great lineup of presenters and we've got a further two panelists who are going to join us for the Q&A session. Our speakers are Dara Turnbull from Housing Europe, my colleague Katrina Lawler in the Housing Agency, who'll be speaking about the expanded role of Part 5 in delivering affordable as well as social housing, and Professor Michelle Norris of UCD on the lessons learned over the last 20 years from tenure mixing in Ireland. Joining us for the Q&A session will be Dr. Aideen Hayden of UCD and Pat Fitzpatrick from the Housing Agency. So Dara Turnbull is our first speaker. He is a research coordinator at Housing Europe, the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing. His work primarily focuses on the preparation of research for the Housing Europe Research Observatory, as well as work on a number of EU projects. He's an economist by training, and prior to working for Housing Europe, Dara spent 5 years in the banking and finance sector in Ireland. He holds a Master's in Economic Policy Evaluation and Planning from the National University of Ireland, Galway. So Dara is going to take us through some of the results from a comparative study on funding cost rental housing in 3 European countries commissioned by the Housing Agency as part of our research support programme. The agency's research support programme aims to promote a deeper understanding of issues facing the Irish housing sector and the potential policy solutions. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Dara, if you're able to start screen sharing. Thanks very much.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm just going to start the timer here so I know when my 50 minutes are up. And hopefully you should be able to see my presentation. So indeed, what I'll be bringing you through in quite a short amount of time this morning is the work that Housing Europe has done for the Housing Agency in recent months, which is looking at cost rental housing systems in countries that have these systems in place for many decades. So particularly the case of Austria, Denmark, and Finland. So just very, very quickly at the beginning, for those of you who don't know what Housing Europe is or who we are the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing. We represent about 43,000 local providers of affordable housing right across Europe, both inside and outside the European Union. And we provide about 25 million dwellings to primarily low and medium income households. And in Ireland, we have 2 members. They are Cooperative Housing Ireland and the Irish Council for Social Housing. So in terms of the report, the kind of the who, what and when, the Housing Agency commissioned Housing Europe at the end of last year to conduct this piece of research. And the main focus, I suppose, was kind of as Ireland faces into this future now where cost rental is part of the overall spectrum of housing options. We need to see how has this kind of model been implemented in other countries, what lessons have they learned, and maybe what can they teach Ireland about how to really make sure that the cost rental model is a success, not just in the short term, but also over the long term. We're very happy that our 3 partner organizations in Austria, Denmark, and Finland were also participated in this study with us, and their insights indeed were invaluable in terms of producing this research. The research itself, the final text is now completed and it has been sent to the design team. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we should get the publication printed and to you at least online, by the end of this year. So if you take a look at the Housing Agency website and the Housing Europe website in the coming weeks, hopefully you should be able to spot the actual published piece of research. So what I'm going to take you through very, very quickly in the time that I have is what I suppose we could call the mechanics of the cost rental systems in the three case study countries. And that is basically to give you kind of high-level understanding, as much as such a thing as possible, of how cost rental has been implemented in those countries, how it works in terms of financing, eligibility, and indeed the all-important issue of rent setting. So to look firstly at Austria, we see that we have over 650,000 what we call limited profited cost-based social dwellings, which is about 17% of the overall housing stock in the country. In addition to those limited profit homes, we also have close to 300,000 what we call municipal homes, which is about 7% of the housing stock. However, they are not cost-based. They use a different legislative framework. So within the study, we're only looking at what we call the LPHA, the limited profit housing associations, which do apply the cost recovery principle. Limited profit housing associations have very, very broad eligibility criteria. Indeed, the law underlining them says that they're not allowed to discriminate in favor or against any particular cohort of the population. Therefore, meaning that the housing is open to, in theory, to anybody. However, as I'll explain a bit later on, when public money is granted for the development of these homes, conditions can be attached by the local municipality or by the local region, which does outline some kind of criteria or priorities that should be given in terms of allocation. In practice, about 80% of households in Austria are currently eligible to live in social housing once these application criteria are applied. And the kind of quid pro quo for the public sector in terms of giving funding for these houses is what they call allocation rights. So that means that the municipality or the region will have the right to allocate some of the housing within the limited profit housing association stock. The rest of the allocation will be based primarily on a queue-based system. And indeed, in some regions, the allocation right can be as high as 100%. So one of the key issues to understand about how limited profit housing works in Austria is the financing model. Now, I won't bring you through all of this in quite detail because I don't have the time, and I'm sure it won't make too much sense to you either. So hopefully you'll pursue the actual published report when it's released in a few weeks, and that should give you kind of a far more detailed overview about how all this works. But effectively, you can see there's a quite diversified pool of financing to develop new social housing in Austria. Firstly, you have a public loan, which comes from the region, and that is about 30 to 40% of the total development costs that's required to develop a new social housing development. The interesting thing about the public loan is actually that they are subordinate to private bank loans. So it means that while you're paying your private bank loan, your public loan is interest only, and that helps to keep the cost for tenants quite affordable rate throughout their tenancy. After the public loan, which is subordinate, you have the bank loan, which comes historically from construction banks, which basically issue debt on capital markets, and then that money is used to finance social housing. These are typically 25 to 30-year repayment periods, and currently the interest rate on the private loans will be about 1 to 1.5%. In addition, this is something which maybe isn't known. I know back when I was in Ireland, you heard a lot of talk about the Vienna model and how social housing in Austria worked, but maybe it isn't known that actually equity from social housing providers themselves is an important part of financing of new development in Austria. So about 10 to 20% of the capital required to develop new social housing in Austria will actually come from the provider themselves, from their own savings and revenues. And what's interesting is that they're allowed to charge up to 3.5% interest on that lending. So effectively, they're almost like they're lending the money to themselves and charging interest, which is paid by the tenant. And then that 3.5% interest will in the future help to finance future social housing development. So actually what we see is that within the developers themselves, there's kind of a revolving fund where money is recycled and constantly reinvested into into the sector and into their housing stock. Another thing which probably isn't that well known in Ireland is the tenant equity contribution, which is becoming more and more common in Austria. And this can make up to 5 to 10% of the total investment required to develop social housing in Austria. So effectively, when a tenant moves into a building, they could be required to pay what is effectively kind of like a down payment for access to that building. And what we see is that as land prices have been increasing in recent years, particularly in urban areas like Vienna, that these sort of payments have become more and more common. So they're not obligatory, but they have become more common in urban areas in order to help the social provider to meet some of the initial costs, particularly around land that they have incurred. And then additional public grants can also be provided, and these can make up to about 5%, and these can help to finance things like solar panels or kind of more sustainable building methods. All of this poses the question when it comes to rent setting. So we have two distinct periods. So obviously the period when the loan is being repaid and the period after the loan is being repaid. Because if we're applying a strict cost rental model, one of the main costs, if not the main cost that has to be met by tenants' rent, is actually the repayment of the loan. So once the loan goes away, once the loan is being repaid, does that mean that the rent being paid by the tenant suddenly becomes quite low? Well, no. That would be quite a difficult situation to find yourselves in, because it would make some of the social housing incredibly cheap and some of it, particularly the newer stock, relatively expensive. So what they have developed in Austria is what they call the Grundmiete, which means the basic rent, and it's currently set at a fixed price of €1.87 per meter squared, and this is reevaluated every 2 years based on inflation. So effectively what it means is once the loans that were used to develop the housing are paid off, you then move into a situation where you pay this basic rent calculated around the size of your social housing unit. So in reality, after the loans are repaid, yes, your rent more than likely will be reduced compared to when the loans were being paid, but only by a very small amount, probably about 50 cents to €1.50 per meter squared overall. Any surpluses which are then generated, because obviously your operating expenses in the building will be confined to things like maintenance, administration. The Grundmiete effectively constitutes a surplus, like a profit, if you like, for the social housing provider. But the law is very strict around this, and it says that any surpluses have to be reinvested into the sector. So basically, there's a closed loop. When you pay your rent, that is reinvested on a continual basis into the sector. So I won't go into Denmark in as much detail because there's quite a lot of overlaps in terms of how it functions versus how Austria functions. In Denmark, again, we see quite a large social housing sector of about 20% of the homes. Again, we see that in return for public supports, we have this allocation right, which we saw in Austria. The typical allocation right in Denmark is 25% of the social housing stock. And effectively what this means is that the municipalities can allocate housing to people who are in urgent need, people experiencing homelessness, people who've been perhaps the victims of domestic violence and so on. These people can be accommodated quite quickly. And then for other people who might need access to social housing but have less of an urgent need, they will be allocated based again on a queue-based system. There are three types of non-profits, as they call it, rather than social housing in Denmark. These are family, elderly, and youth. So despite the name family housing is actually for everybody. It's not just for families. It's the general form of cost-based social housing in Denmark. In addition, and this is quite important, maybe something Ireland could learn a lesson from, and indeed many other countries in Europe, social housing is actively engaged in providing housing for older people. And this is becoming quite an important topic in Denmark at the moment, where we're seeing an aging population. We're seeing people who are maybe moving towards the idea of being having later life care at home rather than in, for example, a nursing home. And I'm sure COVID-19 has probably changed some people's impressions about nursing homes and so on. So this type of housing has become particularly desirable, I should say, in Denmark in recent years. So it's quite interesting that actually social housing providers do have a role to play in meeting the the housing needs of older people. And again, this could be interesting for Ireland. They also have a role to play in meeting specific housing needs of younger people, particularly for students or for people who are relocating within Denmark to take up employment opportunities. I know from the news back home that housing for students in Dublin is becoming quite a tricky topic. So potentially Denmark points the way for Ireland in terms of expanding the reach of social housing into maybe things like student accommodation or accommodation for young workers. In terms of the financing structure in Denmark, it's quite less diverse, I would say, than in Austria. So we have one primary funding source, which is from mortgage institutions. So the same as in Austria, what happens is a mortgage institution or a construction institution will issue a bond in capital markets, and then the money raised will then be distributed to social housing providers in order to develop social housing, and that constitutes 86 to 90% of the entire money required. What's interesting about those bonds is actually they're given a state guarantee, which means that they become less risky from the point of view of investors. And it means that the borrowing rates attached to those bonds are much lower, and therefore the interest rate paid by the social housing provider is also lower. The other main source of financing is a interest-free 50-year loan, which constitutes about 8 to 12% of the financing required. And then again, the same as you saw in Austria, in Denmark, there's a tenant equity, which is about 2% of the development cost. Although in Denmark, this is mandatory, it's an optional 2% equity. In the event that you can't make that 2% equity, of course, there are public programs available to help you do so. Again, in the Danish case, we need to look at, okay, how are the rents set? So we have these two clear phases. We have the phase in which the loans are being repaid, and then we have the phase after the loans are being repaid. So in order to avoid the cost rent suddenly going to quite a low level and making older social housing very, very cheap compared to newer social housing, what they've effectively done is after 45 years, whatever the rent you're paying is effectively fixed at that level, and that continues into the future. So even after loans are being repaid, the rent that a tenant is paying continues to be in line with the rent they're paying when the loans were being repaid. And the surpluses generated from this, 1/3 are retained locally for reinvestment into the local housing stock, maintenance and so on. And then 2/3 are paid into a national housing fund, which provides all sorts of funding opportunities for social housing providers. And quickly, because I realize my time is up, I will bring it to Finland. So Finland is quite close to the Danish model in terms of financing structures. One important difference in Finland, though, is how the rent is set. So in the Austrian and Danish cases, the cost rent is set at the level of the individual building, whereas in Finland, the cost rent is set at the level of the individual housing association. So if you're a housing association with maybe up to I think the largest housing association in Finland has about 50,000 units. The cost recovery principle, or the cost equalization principle, is at the level of those 50,000 units rather than one or two blocks within that overall stock. So what effectively means is that any unexpected costs and so on can be equalized out over the whole housing stock that you have. This works quite well in large urban hubs, but in smaller cities where depopulation might be an issue or so on, or there might be an oversupply of housing, this can create some difficulties, of course. So again, I won't go through the Finnish financing in great detail because it effectively is the same as in the Danish case, primarily based off lending from private financial institutions with a state guarantee in order to keep interest rates low. Again, we have this two-period phase. We have the period in which the loans are being repaid. And then, interestingly, we have the post-loan repayment periods. And legally speaking, actually, in Finland, once the loan has been repaid, it ceases to be legally classified as social housing. However, what we know is that in 91% of cases in the last 20 years, after ceasing to be legally social housing, the rent offered continues to be in line with social housing rent. And any surpluses that are generated are reinvested into the overall social housing stock. This is a summary of the main points I've raised. I won't go into it in detail, but again, I encourage you all to please read the paper when it comes out in a few weeks' time. The two key takeaways I would like to give you from this talk are: one, the focus on a long-term approach, which is key to the success of the systems in the 3 countries studied, but also importantly for Ireland, cost-based housing or cost rental housing is not a monolith. Even within the 3 countries in the study, we see there's quite important differences around financing, allocation, and rent setting. Therefore, the report is a guide, it is not a blueprint. So if people looking at it in Ireland want to pick it up, that's fine, but they need to work it a way to make it work within the Irish context. And then finally, I would just like to thank very much the Housing Agency for their support in this research. And again, I hope that you all have the opportunity to read it in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dara. Thank you very much, Dara. That was absolutely fascinating. I think it's great to get an insight on cost rental from these 3 countries where, you know, it constitutes up to a fifth of all housing tenure, and especially in the year where we've delivered the first cost rental homes that people are now living in, that we get a greater understanding of how cost rental is being funded sustainably. As you described it in Austria, it's in an ongoing closed loop where money is being reinvested back into the system to develop and further develop these homes. I thought it was also interesting what you said about how the tenant provides an equity contribution in Denmark and Austria, and also the housing developers' contribution being up to 20%, and how these work. So I think everybody's going to, you know, look forward to the report being published. Just part of the ambitious delivery targets for affordable homes do include cost rental, and they're going to be met. Some of it will be met through the expanded requirement of Part 5. So we have my colleague Katrina Lawler here this morning to explain more about the role of Part 5 and how it can help achieve affordability. I've just realised, I'm sorry, I had my mic down. I hope some of you were able to hear what I said there. I'm just going to introduce Katrina Lawler. Katrina heads up the Part 5 team within the agency, and this team provides guidance and support to local authority Part 5 practitioners, as well as policy support to the Department of Housing. Katrina has previously worked on policy areas including HAP, RAS and social housing eligibility within the Housing Agency. I just ask people also to please remember to put in any questions you have to the Q&A session into the chat box or the Q&A box at on the panel below the screen. So I'm going to hand over to Katrina now. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosalind. Hopefully my slides are visible there. So good morning, everybody. As Rosalind said, I'm here this morning to talk about the expanded role of Part 5 in Housing for All, in particular the affordable housing element. So I think it's worth beginning by speaking about, or reminding everybody what is Part 5. Most people will be familiar with it already, but it's always worth revisiting the principles behind it. It's Part 5 of the Planning and Development Act 2000 to 2021, and that's actually where the name comes from. That's why it's in Roman numerals rather than just in numbers. And the basic principle is that the grant of planning permission results in an increase in the land value. So if you have a particular piece of land that doesn't have planning permission and doesn't have hope of getting planning permission, that has a particular value. But if planning permission was to be granted on that land, the value of the land would increase substantially. And it's really the difference between the value of the land without planning permission and with it that's known as the planning gain or the betterment value of land. And Part 5 is intended to capture a portion of the value increase for the state to be used for social and affordable housing provision. This is achieved through a Part 5 agreement between the local authority and the developer for the delivery of housing or of land. Another twin objective under Part 5 is the principle of integrated development, which is to be achieved through the delivery of social and affordable housing in private developments with the aim of countering housing segregation. The Affordable Housing Act 2021, which was introduced over the summer, amended Part 5. The main amendment is that the Part 5 requirement has now been increased back up to 20% on all residential developments in all local authority areas. An additional change is that 10% of the Part 5 requirement must be applied towards the provision of social housing support. The additional 10% can be either used towards affordable housing. If the local authority doesn't have a demand for it, it can be used towards an additional discount on the social housing that is provided. This is a bit of a change from how the scheme was previously structured. So between 2000 and 2015, local authorities could determine a Part 5 requirement of up to 20% based on the affordable and social housing need in their area. And in practice, this meant that there was different Part 5 requirements in different parts of the country. The focus now really is on 20% Part 5 requirement in all local authority areas, with the focus on capturing the same percentage of the planning gain everywhere, which provides certainty and fairness to landowners and developers. Another amendment is that housing acquired under Part 5 can now be used for cost rental, which I'll talk more about in a second. And then finally on this slide, there are temporary transition arrangements which apply to sites purchased when the Part 5 requirement was 10%. So if you purchased a site between 2015 and 2021, the Part 5 requirement at that point was 10%, and you would have priced the land accordingly when you were purchasing it. So it's appropriate that you would retain that 10% requirement. Just a quick plug for the housing agency. We've been doing workshops with local authorities and with the housing sector about the amendments to Part 5. So if you do want a more detailed, more deep dive into it, there is a workshop available on our YouTube channel. As I mentioned, the Part 5 is satisfied through an agreement between the developer and the local authority. I think it's worth just reminding us of the options that are available to comply with Part 5. The first is I suppose these haven't changed. These are the same as they were before the Affordable Housing Act was introduced. The first option is for the transfer of 20% of the land to the local authority at existing use value, unless the transition arrangements apply. So as we mentioned on the previous slide, transition arrangements apply, it'll be 10% of the land. Existing use value is the value of the land without the benefit of planning permission or without the hope of getting planning permission, and is generally below market value and often substantially below market value. If the local authority and the developer choose not to opt for the transfer of the land, there are alternative options. The most common people will be familiar with is the transfer of completed houses on site. So this is where the local authority agrees with the developer to buy certain houses in the development under a Part 5 agreement. There's also options for the transfer of houses on site, leasing, and various combinations. Really, the key with the alternative options is that the local authority must achieve the equivalent of 20% of the planning gain when going for any of the alternative options under B, which is they want to achieve the same as they would have achieved if they'd gone for option A for the transfer of the land. So focusing in on affordable housing under Part 5, there are two mechanisms for delivering affordable housing under Part 5. The first is the Affordable Dwelling Purchase Arrangement under the 2021 Act. There are regulations still to be finalised. The regulations to be finalised, but they're expected to be issued shortly. The thing that we do know is that direct sales agreements will be much more prominent this time around. So direct sales is where the local authority nominates a buyer who then purchases the property directly from the developer. One issue, I suppose, that keeps coming up for clarification, I think it's important to restate at this stage, is that unlike some of the other affordable housing schemes, Part 5 will be available, affordable housing under Part 5 will be available in every local authority if it works and if they can make it viable. I will come back to this in terms of what that means in a minute, but it's just important to know that it's not linked to the other affordable housing schemes. The second mechanism for delivering affordable housing is cost rental. The designation processes have been defined, but there are still additional regulations to be published. The delivery to date has mostly been using the cost rental equity loan with AHBs, and it's really under this mechanism that we see Part 5 delivering cost rental most effectively. So if you have a turnkey which is purchased by an AHB and they're going to use CREL to deliver cost rental, there will still be a Part 5 requirement on that development, and we would say working very well where there'd be a 10% social, and then the affordable element under Part 5 would be cost rental rather than affordable dwelling purchase. I think this table has been on, I think it was on most of the presentations yesterday, the Housing for All targets, but it is important to keep restating it. And I just want to focus in on the second row there, affordable and cost rental homes. So just a breakdown of those over the next 5 years between the two different tenures. The key point really is that Part 5 will deliver cost rental and affordable purchase over the next 5 years, but it probably won't be the primary mechanism for delivering them. So for cost rental, we would expect that most of the delivery will come through the AHBs and through the Land Development Agency. And then for affordable purchase, again, it will be mostly through the First Home Shared Equity Scheme and the various schemes available to local authorities to deliver affordable purchase, as well as through the LDA. So while Part 5 will play its part, it might not be the primary mechanism for delivering affordable housing. I suppose we've talked about the legislative mechanisms for Part 5 delivering affordable housing, but really the key is can Part 5 achieve affordability for the income groups that the local authority wants to target? So the basic principle of Part 5 is that the planning gain is applied to reduce the capital cost of housing. But what maybe is not as widely realised is that Part 5 cost reduction has two components. The first is the land at existing use value, as we've already discussed. So if a local authority is buying a piece of land from the developer in the development, they pay existing use value, which is generally a lot less than the market value. And if they're purchasing houses or apartments from the developer, they will purchase the land associated with those properties at existing use value as well. And that's one element of the discount. But there is a second one, which is that the purchase price of homes under Part 5 is based on the construction cost and not the market price. So there is actually these two elements of the Part 5, I suppose, discount, as it's known. And the reduction in cost may be sufficient to deliver affordable sale or cost rental housing to the income groups that the local authority wants to target. Part 5, the tenure, affordable housing, I suppose, as a tenure under Part 5 in its current form, it's very new. So of course there are challenges associated with it. The big challenge as we'd see it is the additional analysis which is required to determine viability, and this will have to be done by the local authority before the Part 5 agreement is signed with the developer. This can be challenging with affordable purchase. They'll have to calculate what sale price would be affordable to the income group that they want to target, and then they have to calculate if they can deliver Part 5 for that price, and also if they can deliver housing which would be attractive for those purchasers to buy. For cost rental, it's more complicated again because you have to factor in management and maintenance, and as Sarah pointed out, there's various different funding mechanisms for cost rental available. So it's a complex calculation, and it does have to be done in good time to allow the Part 5 agreement to be made. The key point really is what if they get it wrong? There is a big risk here that what if properties don't sell, or maybe if there's a sudden fall in property prices and suddenly the Part 5 prices are below the market prices in the local area. I suppose the fallback option here could be that these properties could be transferred over to social housing, but that does depend on the availability of exchequer funding. One maybe way to mitigate the risk for this is for the local authority to reduce the number of houses they acquire in the development. And when you're spreading the Part 5 discount over a smaller number of properties, this reduces the capital cost and can increase affordability. One final point just on this slide is on integrated development, which I won't speak too much about because I know Michelle is going to talk about it next. But just from a maintenance point of view, really, we've been coming across this issue lately with local authorities. So the debate is pepper potting versus clustering in Part 5 developments. So pepper potting is where the properties are scattered throughout the development, and clustering is where they're all together, maybe in the one area, or most of them are together in the one area. Pepper potting works very, very well for affordable purchase because obviously after the sale, the local authority doesn't have any management or maintenance obligations. Clustering can work better maybe where it's a cost rental or social housing, particularly where it's delivered through apartments, that there are huge efficiencies and savings to be made by maybe purchasing one apartment block as opposed to purchasing different apartments scattered throughout the whole development. But I'll leave Michelle to talk more about that. And then just some final comments. I suppose it is important to say that Part 5 has delivered substantial amounts of social housing and does continue to deliver them. So it gets a lot of bad press coverage, I think the media coverage particularly, but there is evidence in the figures. So in 2019, which I suppose is the last full year pre-COVID, 23% of new build social housing delivery did come through Part 5. So it is delivering substantial amounts of social housing. One thing that we've certainly have evidence of, and I think would be widely acknowledged, is that there is much better engagement with developers. There was a lot of resistance to Part 5 in the very, very early days. And I think a lot of that it's all but disappeared really in most cases. In some areas, in fact, Part 5 is seen as a benefit, both by developers and by their lenders, because it's a guarantee of upfront sales, and maybe in developments where selling might be more difficult. And then finally, Part 5 provides more opportunities for local authorities to meet the housing needs of people living in their areas. So Part 5 can give local authorities an opportunity to get housing, both social and affordable, in areas where they might not have any land or any prospect of getting land. And also, as we mentioned, there's 3 different tenure types under Part 5 now, which does give people a lot more options. Thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Katrina. I think you gave a really good, clear outline of the legislative changes in the 2021 Act for Part 5. And your description of whether Part 5 can achieve affordability, both kind of the 2 mechanisms, the land use value and the purchase price of the home being construction cost and not the market price, I found very interesting. I think it does lead your presentation, and you mentioned pepper potting versus clustering, which is something I first heard about when the Housing Agency, along with the Irish Council for Social Housing, commissioned a piece of research, which we're now going to hear about from Professor Michelle Norris. She is giving a presentation on an analysis of clustered and dispersed social homes in mixed tenure estates. The piece of research, it's nearing completion, and Aideen Hayden will be joining us afterwards for the panel discussion. Michelle is a professor of social policy. She's also the director of the Geary Institute of Public Policy at UCD. She publishes extensively on housing, and her research interests include the management and financing of social housing, regeneration and comparative analysis of housing in Europe. She's a member of the NESC, chair of the Housing Finance Agency, and a member of the board of the Land Development Agency. She's an expert advisor to the Housing 2030 project, which aims to improve the capacity of governments to improve housing affordability and sustainability. So we're really delighted to have Michelle here and Aideen here with us today to discuss this piece of research. So I'm now going to hand over to Michelle. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, albeit not in person, but I think it's a super event. And my presentation builds very nicely on the excellent presentation done by Katrina on Part 5 of the Planning and Development Act 2000, because it looks at clustered and dispersal of social housing in mixed tenure estates. So just to acknowledge, the presentation builds on a piece of work I conducted collaboratively with a couple of colleagues from UCD, including Dr. Aideen Hayden, my colleague, who is also participating, but we decided we wouldn't try jointly present the research. So Aideen's available and will participate in answering questions at the end. And also just to acknowledge that the report was commissioned by the Irish Council for Social Housing and by the Housing Agency. So we're extremely grateful to colleagues in both organisations for funding and also for their help in the implementation of the research and very useful feedback.
Is it moving along for you, Michelle?
No, I'm not sure.
No.
Why.
If it
double click on it, just double click on it first and then move it forward, Michelle.
Good, thank you. So just a bit of background, Katrina mentioned that a lot of interest in tenure mixing started with the enactment of the 2000 Planning Act and particularly Part 5. There was some tenure mixing prior to that in estates developed by individual local authorities and approved housing bodies, and particularly in the Dublin Docklands development area. But really after the 2000 Planning Act, it became much more widespread. So The paper looks at the lessons that can be learned over 20 years later about the delivery, design and management of mixed tenure estates. And it focuses in particular on estates delivered by AHBs or where the social housing element in the estates is AHB housing. And as I mentioned in the introductory slide, I'm looking at the location of social housing in these estates in particular, and whether it is clustered or dispersed or pepper potted. It's the term Katrina used for the same thing. And what's the preferred approach? So the project aimed to examine a number of key research questions. Firstly, we tried to ascertain to what extent AHB housing is delivered in dispersed, is organised or is dispersed or is clustered in mixed tenure estates. Why do AHBs adopt either approach? And are there any best practice lessons we can draw on from their experience of delivering social housing in mixed tenure estates over this very lengthy period? We also looked at some additional questions, including, are there any underlying factors beyond the control of AHBs that influence their decision to cluster or disperse the social housing? What's their experience of managing the housing in different settings? Are there associated costs with different options for clustering and dispersal social housing? What are the experiences of residents of clustered and dispersed social housing estates? And how are social housing units procured under Part 5 of the Planning and Development Act, and also procured under or using different mechanisms? So in order to implement the research, we used a number of strategies. The first is we did a survey of Tier 3 AHBs. So I know many people attending today are from the AHB sector, so you'll know what Tier 3 means, but just to explain for those of you who don't, the regulator of the AHB sector categorises AHBs into Tiers 3, 2 and 1. And Tier 3 refers to larger AHBs with more than 300 units who are actively involved in the development of new housing, including using loan finance. So it really encompasses the larger AHBs, and the AHBs we surveyed either owned or managed a total of just under 30,000 social housing units. So it makes up a very large proportion of the social housing sector, the AHB social housing sector. Now, in addition to that, we also conducted case studies of 5 mixed tenure estates, and we have anonymized the estates in the study, and you'll see we gave every estate the name of a tree, but just to acknowledge the AHBs that are involved in providing and managing these estates provided us with enormous help in implementing the research, so I'm very grateful to them. So we picked the different estates to encompass a variety of locations. So we have some estates in large towns, some in Dublin, suburbs and city centre, and some in small, one in a small town in Munster. We also picked different dates of construction or delivery, and different mechanisms for delivering the social housing, some of it procured via Part 5, and some of it procured using turnkey mechanisms or built directly by the AHB. And we also tried to pick a variety of tenure mixes in terms of number of private dwellings and also design of dwellings. So some estates consist of mainly apartments, and some consist of mainly houses, and some consist of a mix. So in each of the 5 case study estates, we interviewed 10 key informants, including residents, local authority officials, councillors, AHB managers, AHB CEOs, and we also interviewed most but not all of the property developers and builders involved in the delivery of the estates. So I want to go on now and just briefly take you through the findings of the research, and like Dara's project, we hope it'll be published in the next month or so and will be available on the Housing Agency website for you to look at in more depth. So the kind of first key finding of the research relates to the extent and benefits of AHB provided social housing in mixed tenure estates. Firstly, the extent of AHB provided social housing in mixed tenure estates is very extensive. Our research shows that among the tier 3 AHBs, just under 80% of all of their housing is located in mixed tenure estates. The AHB and local authority staff and councillors we interviewed, and we also interviewed a large number of central government policymakers, were all very strongly supportive of the need for tenure mixing. And all of the case study estates have settled very well and can be considered successful. The second point relates to the clustering and dispersal of the AHB social housing in these mixed tenure estates. So it was quite striking when we interviewed residents and AHB staff and central and local government officials that most of the interviewees supported the dispersal or pepper potting of the social housing throughout the estate. But in practice, our survey of tier 3 AHBs indicates that the vast majority of housing they deliver in mixed tenure estates is clustered, about 71%. 13.7% is dispersed throughout the estate, and 15% is clustered and dispersed. So that typically refers to a situation where there's social housing clustered together in an apartment block in one part of the estate, and there's also social housing dispersed throughout the housing standard two-storey housing element of the estate. So despite the strong support for dispersal, we found that most of the social housing in these estates is clustered, and that has been the situation consistently over time, because we also asked AHBs for the construction period of the different dwellings they have in mixed tenure estates. So that hasn't changed. And just to go into the reasons why AHBs used clustering. We looked at the methods used to procure dwellings in mixed tenure estates, part 5, direct construction, and what's often called turnkey construction or purchase builder. And we found no obvious relationship between the methods used to procure the dwellings and the decisions to cluster or disperse the dwellings. But there does seem to be a relationship between the methods used to fund the purchase or construction of social rented housing and decisions to cluster and disperse. So until 10 years ago, most general needs standard family AHB housing was funded using a mechanism called the Capital Loan and Subsidy Scheme. And these dwellings are much more likely to be clustered. Whereas in the last 10 years, local authority or AHBs have much more commonly used the capital advance leasing facility and a loan to fund the purchase or construction of social housing. And this more recent social housing is much more likely to be dispersed. So when we interviewed AHB CEOs and managers, these interviews indicate that this decision to disperse social housing procured under CAF reflects the higher revenue funding available from the CAF scheme, which allows them to, for instance, pay management fees in apartment blocks when they disperse their social housing. Ease of management and minimisation of management costs were also cited generally as a reason for clustering. Developers did raise a preference for clustering because it, from their point of view, it meant that the private housing was more saleable. But this wasn't actually raised as very commonly as a concern or raised very commonly by the AHBs interviewed. Trina raised some interesting points about the role of sale of AHB housing in terms of supporting the general construction of housing. And that was an issue that was raised by a lot of the interviewees we spoke to for our study, particularly the developers. So some of the developers admitted that they'd changed their minds on part 5 over the years, in part because the purchase of social housing via part 5, or also just the purchase of social housing in developments just at market prices often underpins the financial viability of private housing in mixed estates. And they mentioned in particular the fact that the residential density rules now require much higher densities than was the case in the past. And this can make it difficult for them to raise finance, particularly for apartment blocks or higher density developments. And they argue that the fact that Part 5 guarantees funding as a certain proportion of houses are purchased by an AHB or a local authority, that guarantee enables them to raise the debt that they need to fund the rest of the estate. And particularly in lower house price and lower land value parts of the country, some of the developers said that simply the private housing would not be built without the pre-sale of social housing via Part 5 and also via just open sale. And they argued that the participation of AHBs and also investment funds, they didn't differentiate in terms of who they were willing to sell to, but they argued that was vital to scheme economics. So I think an interesting issue that needs further exploration. Then just in relation to the scale, design and makeup of mixed tenure estates, interesting points were raised by senior AHB officials and also central government and local authority planners we interviewed around policy on tenure mixing. So this was seen as very, very beneficial, important, valuable on the one hand, but on the other hand, concerns were raised that the planning system and the focus on social mixing is solely at a state level. And there's really no ongoing efforts to monitor or address segregation by income at neighbourhood, town or city level. They also highlighted the importance of neighbourhood amenities for the success of mixed tenure estates. So some of the factors that make mixed tenure estates successful and settled and popular and in demand are actually outside the estate and related to the wider neighbourhood. And it raises interesting and important issues, I think, about our planning for successful neighbourhoods in urban areas. We also asked about the design of mixed tenure estates, and there was an overwhelming consensus both among the residents we interviewed, the AHBs and local authority staff, and the property developers and builders that so-called tenure blind external design is best. So that means that the design of the different tenures is externally indistinguishable, even if the internal design of the house or apartment may vary. Katrina mentioned the Affordable Housing Act 2021 and the new, I call them intermediate tenures introduced in the Act, including cost rental and affordable housing for sale. And a lot of our interviewees argued that these provide a really important opportunity for AHBs to expand their activities, engage in the development of larger estates, and look at different forms of tenure mix within these estates, not just social and private housing, but social, cost rental, private, and also affordable housing. So just in terms of AHB's development strategies, there are lots of benefits, in addition to the benefits in terms of the state providing a wider range of housing for a wider range of income groups. In terms of managing the estates then, there was a consensus among the residents and the AHB staff we interviewed that building good neighbourly relations is very important, and providing opportunities for neighbours from different tenures to socialise together, meet each other, form relationships was very important. So things like playgrounds that enables residents to mix are very important. Concerns about potential antisocial behaviour were raised by a lot of the private residents we interviewed, even though actual instances of antisocial behaviour in the case study estates were rare. So this was a concern for the AHB staff because they felt sometimes demands that there should be vetting of applicants for social housing by private residents were not always feasible and weren't always fair. And the social rented tenants were very concerned about being labelled and kind of internal stigma within the estates. So they weren't keen on this idea either, but they were keen on tenure blind design for that reason. And the AHB staff we interviewed raised concerns that dealing with owner management companies in high density estates can be challenging. They raised some concerns about the management of owner management companies, the adequacy of sinking funds, and just the level of existing or additional requirements it places on AHBs and demands in terms of liaising with them. Well, finally, I just want to then outline some implications for housing policy and practice, and then planning policy and practice from the study. So I suppose the first point about the study is it underlines the extent and also the value of tenure mixing and the importance of designing, procuring estates in a way that will support the development of communities that are socially and economically sustainable. So that bit of the sustainability debate, I feel, is sometimes forgotten and needs to be emphasised. The study is a bit more agnostic about the benefits of clustering versus dispersal. And I suppose my view is that should really depend on the particular context of the development, its location and size, and the tenure mix of adjacent estates and neighbourhoods. But one of the issues raised by the study is that decisions to cluster or disperse social housing are often based on practical factors such as cost, not on the context. And the new intermediate tenures, social or cost rental housing and affordable housing for sale, have the potential to support even more fine-grained tenure mixing of estates, but the funding subsidy model has to support. Then in terms of implications for planning policy, there's a need to build in mechanisms for monitoring and addressing neighbourhood, town and city level socio-spatial segregation of different income groups into planning policy, not just a focus on individual estates. Even though that's important, it's not enough on its own to ensure we avoid socio-spatial segregation. There's a need for comprehensive review of the residential density guidelines, which takes account of their socioeconomic impact and implications for commercial housing provision and also for tenure mixing. There's a need to involve AHBs at an earlier stage in the negotiation of Part 5 agreements, whereas they tend to just come in when the agreement is about to be finished. And then finally, just some implications for housing estate design and management. Tenure blind external design is definitely the preferred option for mixed tenure estates. It has lots and lots of benefits and was supported by both developers and local authorities and AHBs and residents of mixed tenure estates. It's very important to provide shared facilities such as playgrounds to enable residents of different tenures to meet each other and build relationships and build a strong community. Good estate management is very important. And also the report also flags up some issues around the operation of owner management companies in high density estates and suggests some reforms regarding the legislation on multi-unit developments. So thank you very much. That was everything I planned to present today, and Aideen and I are very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much, Michelle. So we've heard from Dara on cost rental and funding lessons from abroad to ensure that not only is cost rental housing delivered, but also that the ongoing management, maintenance and renovation is funded. Katrina has spoke about the expanded role of Part 5, under which social and other forms of social housing will be delivered as part of mixed tenure housing schemes. And Michelle has finished with some really interesting implications for both, I suppose, policy and planning in terms of new housing schemes being designed and developed in the areas of estate design and management to create successful, sustainable mixed communities. So I'm now going to ask all the panelists to turn on their sound and videos. We've had quite a few questions come in through the chat box. Some have been answered by the panelists already, but we're going to take you through some of those now. But please, you can continue to ask questions and we'll try and get through as many as we can. We're joined on the panel by Dr. Aideen Hayden of UCD, who has authored and co-authored a number of reports on mixed tenure developments, social housing delivery, and the private rented sector. She is a coordinator of the European Network of Housing Research, and she's also chair of Threshold, a former member of Shannon Aaron, and is on the board of the Housing Finance Agency. We're also joined by Pat Fitzpatrick from the Housing Agency. Pat heads up the Approved Housing Body Services Unit, managing the assessment of AHB P&A CAF funding applications on behalf of the department. He's also been involved with the Part 5 legislation since 2007, supporting the department and local authorities with implementation issues. So I suppose looking at the questions, they've kind of come under, I suppose the tenure mixing is a big part of it. Part 5, management and maintenance and funding. But I think I'm going to start with a kind of a question first to Dara, as he spoke first, that came in. And I suppose it's a more general question around cost rental, Dara. So in Ireland, or in the countries you looked at, cost rental is broadly filling the role of social housing, whereas in Ireland we're defining social and affordable as mutually exclusive, with cost rental reserved for middle income households. Does this distinction make sense in the European context, or are we missing the social element that was built into European cost rental from the outset? So I'm going to give you that question to answer, and if any of the other panelists would like to come in, please feel free to add to Dara's answer. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose what's important to remember about the systems that we looked at in the study is that they haven't developed overnight. In the case of Austria, for example, the key pillars, if you like, of the cost-based system have existed for many decades now, and that's the case in Denmark and indeed in Finland. So indeed the allocation rights that I mentioned in Denmark and in Austria, that does fill the hole for social housing in terms of the most urgent needs. So people who are experiencing homelessness, or people who are victims of domestic abuse and so on, they can be allocated housing directly by the municipality in a relatively short period of time. And then for other people, it's the queue-based system that I mentioned. But that was designed into the system from day one. The situation that we have in Ireland, and maybe some of the other panelists can correct me on this, but has also evolved over a very long period of time. First, we had local authorities providing social housing, and then more recent times we have AHBs doing a similar kind of role. So effectively, rather, if you wanted to adopt a more Danish or Austrian approach to social housing, you would need to find a way of effectively transitioning from the current system into a new system. What I imagine happened in the Irish context is that the policymakers looked at that option and said, that's going to be too tricky for us to manage. We have people at the moment who are paying social rents based on their income, not on the cost of delivery for the actual provider. So trying to transition from an income-based system to a cost-based system is probably not feasible. So I reckon that's probably why this kind of dichotomy exists, where on one hand you have the income-based local authority AHB system, and the other side you have the new cost rental, which will also be delivered, of course, by AHBs. But it's interesting to know that Ireland actually isn't unique in that context in terms of having this spectrum of social housing with kind of different legal structures and different funding structures within the same country. So if you look at our neighbours in England, for example, they have affordable rental housing, which is not to be confused with social housing, which is fixed at 80% of the market rate, for example. So again, that's kind of a system within a system. And indeed in Scotland and Wales, you have similar kind of intermediate rental options, which would be, again, kind of a parallel system to the more established social housing system. And then indeed, when you look in Europe, I mean, in Luxembourg, for example, again, in recent years, you've seen the development of a affordable rental system to complement the pre-existing social housing system. And I think what's really happening here is that more and more middle-income households are finding it difficult to access affordable housing, particularly within cities in Europe. So as a result, policymakers are trying to develop affordable or intermediate rental options after the fact. So rather than trying to blend them into the current system, you get this kind of clear separation between the long existing social system and the kind of the newer, more intermediate kind of system. And that's what's happened in Ireland. And I would expect, given the states, the many young people and middle income households are in many of the European countries, that this will be modeled copied elsewhere in the coming years.
Great, thank you, Dara. Michelle or Aideen, Patrick, Katrina, would any of you like to come in on that, or will I move on to the next question?
Maybe we just briefly say that
Yep.
Michelle and I did a report on the funding of council housing, and we very much favoured a change in the model of delivery towards a cost-based system. I think Dara is right. I think it's potentially a step too far. I think what we're seeing is a layering of one policy on top of another, rather than trying to develop some consistent policy that goes across the entire housing sector. So, I mean, it was very interesting to hear you make that point, Dara, and maybe on another occasion we might dust off that report, Michelle, and take that into account.
Okay, thanks, Aideen. The next question I have is maybe for you, Pat. It's about part 5. And the question is, and I suppose this kind of, it's more general, there've been a couple of questions around this area. Is it a very high risk for local authorities taking affordable units under part 5 with no guarantee of funding if they don't sell under the affordable model, and have to come back and have to bring them back into social use? So some local authorities, as we know, are already holding a stock of unsold affordable units. And my screen has just shifted. But anyway, that was the question, Pat, if you're able to.
It is a risk for the local authority, because for social housing, it's very clear you agree to buy the social housing and the money comes from the Department of Housing at the completion of the property. When you're embarking on affordable housing, and Katrina mentioned in her presentation as well, first of all, at the outset, it needs more thought. Is there a prospect of selling these properties to affordable purchasers? So that comes back to the demand in your area, the market prices, and what the price that these properties can be delivered at. So there's a lot of work that a local authority needs to do and understand its affordability in its area. But the existing stock that was alluded to, the existing stock of unsold affordables happened in 2008, 2009 with the economic crash, where massive drop in market values and properties. So all of those were working through the system and were being sold to affordable purchasers. But that was a significant shift in the market. And that could happen again. So there's no question that these things you're at the mercy of the market forces. But there are things you can do. And I know we've been working with the Housing Delivery Coordination Office as well on a suite of tools and documents and so on, and flow charts, everything to try and help local authorities understand what they're embarking on. To answer the question, first of all, is it worth embarking on affordable housing in our area? Can we delivering at a lower enough price? And if we can't sell them, what happens? And you can, through direct sales agreement, build in some mitigation measures. That doesn't necessarily have to mean the state buying it for social housing. If the state decided X number of houses in the development was sufficient in terms of mix, well, then the balance should, in theory, continue to be available for market purchasers, and affordable purchasers are market purchasers. So perhaps there are options, for example, in risk sharing opportunities, is that they sell the property on the market if they can't sell it to an affordable purchaser. And that can also reduce the risk for local authorities. But it is a complex area. And as I said, there's a lot more work going on in the background for that, and a lot more support available for local authorities with that decision. Okay,
so then in terms of that, Pat, do you think all local authorities are able to provide affordable housing under the Act? And I suppose following on from that, do you think, and maybe Katrina, is it realistic that all local authorities deliver cost rental housing?
The first part, it has the technical answer is yes, all local authorities can deliver affordable housing, but it comes down to the viability. They can deliver it through Part 5. So some of the other funding streams, the Affordable Housing Fund has limits. It will only provide funding in areas where there is a demonstrated higher affordability demand. But Part 5 is, as we've just said, it's the local authority taking the risk. They're agreeing to take the properties and that they'll be sold to affordable purchasers. So there is no departmental funding involved there. So that does leave the option open to local authorities to try and provide affordable housing. But they need, as I said, to be careful. If they take it, can they sell it, basically? The second part, in terms of cost rental, personally, I don't think any local authority has an appetite to be a market landlord. That cost rental is effectively providing to the private market at limited income thresholds, certain income thresholds. So they can certainly provide cost rental housing. For example, on their own lands, they can, if a share of the properties need to go to cost rental, they can certainly fund it. They have the most efficient form of funding in the funding available from the Housing Finance Agency. and they have a tenure, if it's in an area where the rents are a particular problem, where they can possibly provide the housing and then lease it to another, possibly an AHB, who would manage the cost rental tenure and pay back the loans from returns from the rent. So they can certainly become involved and be partners in providing cost rental. I just don't see them as being large-scale managers of cost rental housing.
Okay, thanks, Pat. We might, oh, Michelle, have you?
If I could just comment on that question, in relation to just the first issue, which is what happens if there's no demand for affordable housing for purchase. I'm sure there is significant demand, because as we know, there are a lot of people who aspire to own their own homes and are having trouble purchasing on the market. But saying that, you know, we did operate this scheme in the past until 2010. There was a lot of dwellings delivered, and some of them couldn't be sold because of the economic crash. Now, that partially reflected, obviously, the very, very severe housing bust we had in this country. But it also reflected the fact that some local authority development plans, in my view, made over provision for affordable housing for sale through Part 5 and under provision for social housing. Because there is still a huge amount of opposition from communities through the planning system, etc., to social housing development. It partially reflected the concerns of councillors, in my view. So I would support Pat's point that now we're back delivering this form of housing again. There's definitely a need for it, but we need to be sure we're actually basing our delivery targets on robust analysis of the need, stroke demand for affordable housing for sale. In relation to cost rental housing, cost rental is targeted at people whose incomes are above the social housing threshold, and the objective is it will deliver housing at 25% below market rents generally for people who can't afford market rents. So those areas that would fall into that category, people on those incomes who can't afford market rents, are primarily the major urban areas in Ireland: Dublin, the Greater Dublin area, Cork, and Galway. And in my view, the most of the cost rental housing would be necessary in those areas. I would be surprised if you could deliver new build housing for 25% below market rents in other parts of the country. And people may want affordable housing for purchase there rather than cost rental. So certainly, in my view, the demand and stroke need is in Dublin. And also, I think a large element of the unaffordability crisis that isn't really being acknowledged is among single earner households, single person households. So I see a big demand for smaller units being delivered through cost rental for people who just can't afford to rent or to purchase in the market in urban areas because they don't have two household incomes. And their needs are not really being met by the social housing sector at the moment. We're building very little small social housing units. And it struck me when there's opposition to new market housing developments. People mentioned that it's not providing family housing, but obviously single people are families too. We're all parts of families. Couples are families too. And that's actually where the main affordability, a major element of the affordability crisis exists among single earner households.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. That kind of single households and I suppose delivery. It's question around, I suppose, the mixed tenure. Actually, Aideen, this might go to you. And I think it's back to the clustered dispersed pepper potting. And the question, I suppose the question is, developers are not interested in pepper potting for numerous reasons. What would incentivize developers to supply units in this manner? Would you have a view on that? I mean, I know your research is kind of looking at the two, and there being reasons for sometimes pepper potting and sometimes clustered. Do you think there would be kind of a reason to incentivize developers? Yeah,
I think, Rosalind, to be fair, and it's one of the things that came out of the report that we've just finished, there are very big structural changes happening within the Irish housing system. The level of institutional investment in housing, particularly in urban areas, is leading to large-scale apartment developments, for example, where units are being sold in large blocks. And fortunately, the AHB and local authority sector have been able to secure some of that housing. But what's not happening is that housing is not being made available into the private market. So what you're seeing, particularly in a city like Dublin, between the two canals, is a move towards, in effect, a densification that's linked to increased height and increased apartment developments that will have an impact on exactly what we're looking at, tenure mix, because what you're going to see is a combination of private rented sector on the one hand, PRS, built to rent, and AHB stroke local authority development as well. So through, I suppose, maybe in terms of the density rules, and it's one of the recommendations that we make in the report, that they need to be reviewed in terms of this idea that we go up and we go high and we focus on apartment developments, which is in reality limiting the market in terms of construction, for example, to 4, 5, 6, 7 large development companies. So you are really looking at a completely different sector. And going back to your question about clustering, I mean, we are seeing clustering by default, because that is what's going to happen. You will cluster, an AHB will buy a block, a local authority will buy a block, an investment fund will buy a block. So nobody will sit there and say, our policy is to develop densification with the idea that we're going to have clustering and that we won't have, in effect, tenure mix. But that's what's happening by default. And just going back to the point that was made about risk sharing that Pat made, the market for housing outside of the main urban areas is very different from the market for housing inside the main urban areas. And one of myself and Bob Jordan did a study on mixed tenure previously, and one of the things that came across quite strongly was the need for some element of risk sharing in the event that you had unsold affordable units, because there's a lack of confidence out there in the market that that product will be sold. And some of that goes back to I suppose the prejudice that there's been over the years around social housing, and the fact that, will people want to buy affordable housing right next door to social housing and so forth. And I know what Pat's saying, it worked well enough in the past, but that is 10 years ago. And, we have to convince everybody that this is a viable option and a viable way to move forward. So I do think there's a number of issues there. It relates to density, it relates to height, it relates to how many purchases are out there for the particular units that are available. I mean, again, this morning, 1,600 units in Clonliffe going to build to rent, singles and studios being 70% of the entire development raises huge questions around exactly that: tenure mix, viability. How does this fit with the broader issues that we're dealing with in terms of what do we want our communities to look like?
Okay, thank you, Aideen. We've a follow-on, maybe kind of related question to that, which is, it's reference to the comment Michelle made regarding the role of councillors in AHB developments. This is so true. We see ongoing debate at monthly council meetings on the merit of AHB developments, big and small. How can we change the narrative? As it often paints kind of an overly negative picture. And I've lost that question. But anyway, that was the question. So I suppose, is there an overly negative picture? Aideen, you mentioned kind of Clonliffe Road development. Is there, from your the positive, I suppose, the kind of the positive results coming through from your research on whether it be pepper potting or clustering of some of the kind of the implications that communities are very settled. You kind of look back over the last 20 years and you're seeing that the mixed tenure communities, that they're settled, that they're kind of the issues potentially that maybe councillors are worrying about are less of an issue, or would you like to comment on that? Really?
Yeah, well, look, Michelle, but yes, certainly the communities that we looked at, there's no question or doubt they were, I have to say, huge kudos to the AHBs involved. There was very strong integration, huge efforts made with the individual communities to have an inclusive society within those communities. And I think it's one of the things that AHBs have been hugely successful in. Everything from residents associations to cleanup days to Halloween parties, they work incredibly hard at bringing communities together. So, that is something I think that needs to be acknowledged as a very big, very, very big part of integration. I suppose the issue really I was trying to raise is that going forward, these developments that we looked at were very successful, but what is the future going to look like? And I think that's one of the issues that we have to be conscious of. One of the developments that we looked at, the AHB housing was mainly being provided in an apartment block, but it was a very high-end kind of area of Dublin. And that's the worry. And that was what was put across by a lot of AHBs, that they see that they will be taking the apartment section of the development that needs to be there in order to get the densities, so that even though, it's a lovely area and all the rest of it, and there's no attempt, in theory, to segregate them, that they are segregated in reality by being the ones who buy the apartment section of the development. And I suppose what we wanted to flag is what's that going to mean going forward if this is the way our housing system is going to develop.
Okay, thanks, Aideen. Pat, would you have any comment on that, or Katrina? If not, I'll move. I have a question for Dara. So Dara, do other countries, so you mentioned during your talk about how I suppose there's a lot of development happening in Denmark, and particularly in the area of housing for older people. And I mean, I would know here as well that, under the various schemes that there is AHBs and local authorities are building this type of housing as well. But the question is, do other countries have similar schemes to our CAS scheme? Now, I don't know if which provides funding for the disability sector. And if so, are the funding limits adequate to build those homes? High building costs are making it very difficult to build or refurbish within local authority limits in Ireland. So it's a question kind of, is that an issue in other countries that you came across?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose developing housing for older people, particularly older people with disabilities or people of any age with disabilities, which in many countries typically fall under the same heading, is an issue. So even in the Danish case that I mentioned, where they have this specific provision of housing for older people, which also includes people with disabilities, any people with mobility issues effectively, where they have this special scheme where they even have providers who only focus on the provision of housing for older people or people with disabilities, the supply still isn't enough. So in our most recent State of Housing report, which came at the beginning of this year, if you look at the profile for Denmark, you'll see that even in the Danish case, it isn't enough. The money isn't enough, the supply isn't enough, the population is aging more quickly than the supply can keep up with. So unfortunately, Ireland is not unique in that regard. So the funding is really never enough in any country. I can't say that there's any country in Europe that doesn't have an issue with this, that doesn't have an issue with funding when it comes to housing for older people or people with disabilities. However, there are degrees to which this is an issue, of course. Again, if we look at the Finnish case, which took the report, again, they have special dedicated providers who only will focus on people, particular cohorts of population. So be it older people, be it people experiencing homelessness, and their housing first strategy has been incredibly successful in that regard. But also people with disabilities. And again, using that funding model that I outlined in the report, they have been quite successful in recent years. They have received additional support from public authorities to back that up. So the question seems to be in Ireland, again, I don't know the class system as well as I used to probably, but indeed you have these kind of funding caps that kind of one size fits all, and they're not sufficient in most parts of the country to actually develop the housing or to renovate the housing to meet the needs of the people. So I think the issue you need to look at is funding. How can you diversify the funding sources, and how can you find clever and creative ways to bridge that funding gap that currently exists? And I think Michelle talked about it briefly earlier, is the Housing 2030 report that both of us worked on over the past year or so. Within that, there's a section on financing, which includes a lot of quite innovative and clever funding sources that could potentially be used to develop this kind of housing in Ireland. I'm thinking particularly of the kind of public banks in the likes of France, which are actually private institutions for public good, and therefore the lending they provide is actually off book. So it could be a way of the government to invest more in this type of housing without falling foul of the Stability and Growth Pact or the fiscal rules that they're often so keen to avoid in this regard.
Okay, thanks, Dara. Now I'm kind of conscious of the time here. I think there's a lot of questions coming in about part 5, about funding arrangements, and I think that maybe what we'll do is finish with a comment from each of you, even around the funding situation. So Dara there has started, and I think Dara's presentation highlighted some of the different funding streams and mechanisms that are available in other European countries. So if we were to think about kind of, I suppose, the long-term funding arrangements, that loop that you mentioned being there to create kind of long-term sustainability. The question is, I suppose, how would you think long-term agreements between developers, AHBs, and local authorities could help the funding situation? Is it the case that current arrangements are too short-term? So really, kind of, is there something else that needs to be done, or is there enough that now has been done? In Katrina's presentation, she talked about the land value uplift and looking at kind of construction costs rather than market costs. But is there something that we're missing, that Dara has pointed out in his presentation, kind of that could really help improve the funding arrangements for developers out there? Is there anything particular that stands out from your knowledge of, I suppose, what was presented on today, or just your deep expertise in this sector? Pat, know a lot about funding. Is there?
Well, I think when you're talking about long-term relationships with developers are typically interested in the short-term relationship. We build and we sell, and maybe that's what they're good at, and that's what they should be left doing. The longer-term piece, AHBs are very good at managing properties, and they're very good at being in it for the long term. So in terms of, if we're talking about cost rental, well, that's definitely a sector that should have a huge advantage and should be grasping hold of the cost rental side, because it is a natural extension, as we were talking about earlier, from it's a support, it's a housing support. So they're already in that market. When we're looking at all of this cost rental, there's a huge benefit to be gained from the availability of finance, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. So the Housing Finance Agency have played their part with long-term financing that is available. AHBs are taking out those loans, and then there's the CREL loan, cost rental equity loan, which helps all that funding side. But the other bit is the construction costs. Like, construction costs have been going to the roof over the last number of months, it's going to probably erode any of the gains that we might get out of an extra 0.25% knocked off an interest rate, for example. But land is the third component of that. Where are we going to build it? I think we are seeing the emerging of the components to a larger scale. We have the Land Development Agency looking at not just local authority land. And people think local authority have loads of land. In fact, they have very little land for developing housing. So land is another issue that needs to be brought into that picture. So I think with the Land Development Agency coming on board, with the AHBs stepping into the cost rental environment, as well as delivering significantly social housing, and with local authorities now looking at a higher take in Part 5, it's creating some momentum. But we're at the start of this new, I suppose, era of affordable housing mixed in with social housing in terms of delivery. So I think we are going to see this change significantly even over the next 2 years as to how all the funding models fit together.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Michelle, you were going to come in there. Would you like to? I think we might
just
finish up on this, if that's okay. Yeah.
I suppose just a general comment around the state's relationship with developers. It always strikes me when I look at countries like Austria and Denmark and the other countries in Europe with larger social housing sectors. One of the differences between them and us is in some ways social housing is treated as an economic policy, not just a social policy. So rather than directly subsidizing developers, they use the social housing sector and investment in social housing to try control booms and busts in the market. So Austrians, for instance, increased spending and funding and output of social housing very significantly after the financial crisis, and it helped stabilize the private sector. So I think that's what we need to be thinking of doing, using state investment more purposefully rather than necessarily providing subsidies. I suppose the other lesson from looking at these countries in relation to finance, I mean, one of the reasons why we are stuck in this long-term boom-bust model of social housing finance. So we have now very, very welcome, very large-scale 20 billion finance promised under Housing for All, so that's super. But we have had many periods where we've had high investment in the past, and then it's been cut back, often when the market is failing. So we need to move out of that boom-bust pattern. And one of the ways we can do that is to diversify the sources of finance. So it was very striking. Social housing in Ireland is 100% state financed through grants, through loans from the Housing Finance Agency, which I chair, but it's state guaranteed money, all on balance sheet. It's all state money. So diversification of finance would certainly help in a controlled way, where the state controls the private finance for the public good. And the other lesson, of course, is the Austrians haven't been selling their social housing off at large scale. So it's 22% of the housing stock there. I've calculated local authorities have built around 20% of the housing stock in Ireland. But the reason why they still have such large social housing supply in Austria is they've kept it in the public sector. And they also recycle the historic investment, Stara's mentioned, and it's reinvested in new supply. So that thing of kind of closing the loop, I thought that was a great phrase. That's a very important takeaway lesson on finance, I feel.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, it's funny how it just echoed that closing the loop and just keeping the funding there to create that long term. It's definitely something we learned from the Vienna model, and now I think from this new research there that we're looking forward to read. So I am going to bring this to an end now. We've actually passed our deadline, so I just want to thank all of the panelists. It's been really interesting. I think there's a lot of questions that I know people still want, but hopefully you can tune in during the rest of the week. We've got a lively discussion happening tomorrow at 11:30, where we're going to have Claire Feeney from the Housing Agency, Donal McManus from the Irish Council for Social Housing, David Kelly from the Department of Housing, and Sinead Gibney from IREC talking about the second pathway in Housing for All. So I hope as many of you in the audience can join that discussion tomorrow. I'd like to thank our virtual audience. We were up at almost 300, I think, at one stage. We've dropped now, people going off for their lunch, but thank you for tuning in, listening and participating through the chat and Q&A panels. And finally, just to say, there's going to be a recording for today's session. It'll be up on our Housing Agency's YouTube channel. Well worth looking at. So you'll be notified when the video goes live, and you can subscribe to our channel by visiting youtube.com/housingagency.ie. So once of all, thank you all, and look forward to reading those reports, upcoming reports very soon. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. You did a great job chairing, Rosalind, so thanks a million.
Yeah, well done, Ross.